Welcome to the Edgeworth Echoes podcast, discovering Edgeworth's town, a hidden gem of Irish history.
Welcome to a new episode of the Edgeworth Echoes podcast. This is your host, John. This episode takes us back to the 16th and 17th centuries and the arrival of the Edgeworths into Ireland and the colourful stories associated with the family. The information in this episode comes from the Black Book of Edgeworthstown and Other Edgeworth Memories, which is a collection of memoirs and family history centred around the Edgeworth family. It was edited by Harriet and Harold Butler and was first published in 1927. The story begins in 1585 with the arrival in Ireland of two brothers, Edward and Francis, from Edgeworth in Middlesex. Edward, the older brother, was a cleric in the Anglican Church, a well-respected clergyman endorsed by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Earl of Leicester. His career in Ireland began at St Patrick's Cathedral, before becoming Vicar of Carrickfergus in 1590 and then Bishop of Down and Connor in 1593. He held this position at the time of his death in 1595. Francis began his career in Dublin, where he became clerk of the First Fruits in the Exchequer. This role involved him in the collection of ecclesiastical fees. In 1606 he was appointed to the office of Clerk of the Crown and Hanaper, jointly with his son-in-law, John King. In this role he was a civil servant dealing with writs, patents and proclamations. For his services to the Crown, King James I rewarded him with a substantial grant of 600 acres, originally confiscated from the O'Farrells, in what would eventually become known as Edgeworthstown. Francis was married 3 times. His first wife passed away before his departure from England, and his second wife, an Irish woman from the prominent O'Kavanagh family, bore him no children. His third wife, Jane Chute, daughter of Sir John Chute of Sunna, Westmeath, was an influential figure in her own right. Raised Catholic, Jane converted to the Church of England upon marriage, but later became known for her fierce dedication to her Catholic faith, and this led to some tension in the family, and the pair split up, with Francis insisting on his children being raised as Anglicans. Jane was only allowed supervised visits to her children until they reached adulthood. Francis passed away in 1627 and was buried at Christ Church. Jane entered service in France with Queen Henrietta Maria, wife of King Charles I of England. After the king's execution, Jane returned to Ireland, where her lands and property had been seized by the orders of Cromwell, and later restored after a new king was crowned. She used her funds to build a religious house in Dublin as a centre for nuns, where she lived until her death in 1641. The next person we meet is John Edgeworth, also known as Shane Moore, Great John, who was the son of Francis Edgeworth and Jane Chute. He resided at the castle of Cranleigh, now called Cranleigh, near present-day Edgeworthstown. A tall, imposing figure, he served as a captain in the army in 1640 and 1641. Shane's lavish lifestyle included hosting extravagant gatherings at Cranleigh Castle. He maintained 2 dining tables, one for his peers and another for the local populace, generously supplied with food, ale, pipes and tobacco. However, this generosity and his indulgence in fashionable pursuits significantly strained his fortune. In October 1641, just days before the Irish Rebellion, Shane left Cranleigh to visit his uncle, James Chute, and subsequently travelled to Dublin, leaving his wife Mary and their young son, also named John, at the castle. On the 20th of October, rebels attacked Cranleigh Castle, seizing valuables and searching for Captain Edward's family. During the attack, the rebels captured young John and threatened to kill him. However, a loyal servant, Edmund MacBride Farrell, intervened. A Catholic himself, MacBride deceived the rebels by pretending to kill the child while secretly hiding him in a bog until nightfall. He later smuggled the boy to Dublin, disguised among straw and fowl, and delivered him safely to a family member. Meanwhile, Mary, Edgeworth, endured brutal treatment at the hands of the rebels. She was stripped, beaten and left exposed to harsh weather, but eventually escaped, possibly with MacBride's help. Disguised as an Irish peasant, she made her way to Dublin and later sought refuge in England with her family in Derbyshire, where she eventually passed away. After his wife's death, Shane married a widow named Mrs. Bridgman and settled at Kilbrew House in County Meath. Mrs. Bridgman's daughter Anne defied her mother's plan to marry her to Sir John Bridgman. Instead, she fell in love with Shane's son John and abducted him, running off together to get married at the age of 14. John was 17 at the time. They wed in a triple ceremony by an Anglican clergyman, a Presbyterian minister and a justice of the peace. This couple eventually settled at Lissard, not far from Edgeworth. Their first son died as an infant, but their second, Francis, was Maria Edgeworth's great-grandfather. Shane passed away in 1668 and was interred in the family vault at St Michael's Church in Dublin. Shane Moore's son John was born in 1638, and he and his wife Anne Bridgman shared a colourful life. John, like his father, was fond of an extravagant lifestyle and was also a gambler. When Anne was presented at the court of King Charles II in the 1670s, the king was enchanted by Anne's beauty and spent some time in conversation with her, which made her very uncomfortable, and she insisted on leaving London soon after. But while in London, and despite vowing to not gamble, John did become involved in a gambling game and lost all his money, 800 guineas, as well as his wife's jewellery. However, before the night was over, he won back his money, the jewellery and a few hundred guineas. His wife made him vow not to gamble again. In 1672, John got involved in a dispute with another gentleman and struck him, an offence that could have resulted in his hand being removed. However, he fled to Ireland and his wife used her connections to obtain a royal pardon. John proved to be as unreliable at managing his finances as he was at gambling, and came close to being imprisoned for his debts. In 1684 he turned to his son Francis, persuading him to mortgage his lands to pay his father's debts. 4 years later, under pressure from his mother, Francis was forced to mortgage more land to pay his father's debts again. During the rebellion of 1688, Francis raised a regiment for William of Orange, and John demanded that he be made colonel of the regiment, with his son demoted. The regiment was removed from the control of the Editors when it was learned that John failed to provide food and uniforms for his men. Back at the family estate, the family were harassed by local rebels known as Rapparees. When John and his sons were away, some local farmers were hired to be watchmen, but proved unreliable, and Anne, at one point, had to lead the men out herself, carrying a pistol to defend their property. When James II tried to regain his throne from William of Orange, the Edgeworths were targeted by local supporters of James and their estate was burned down. Anne and her children were marched on foot to Derry, where she was turned over to the care of Mr. Nugent, who sheltered them until the siege of Derry was lifted. Anne then returned to her former family estates near Warrington. Anne's husband John remained in London, asking the Crown for help. Eventually he was granted a sum of £6,917 and a role as a customs officer for Dublin Port. He was also made governor of Ross Castle in County Kerry, a small estate with a meagre income of 20 shillings per day. John lobbied the government to be appointed as an agent for Irish Protestants and collaborated on a project to improve Irish fisheries. However, neither came to much financially. In 1692 he contested an election for parliamentary seat for County Longford, but was thwarted by the Earl of Granard. John successfully secured election for the borough of St Johnstown, a seat he retained in subsequent elections. Despite this, he continued to struggle financially, still pleading with the Crown for assistance. In 1697 he was granted a sum of £750, but bureaucratic hurdles and poor management prevented him from ever receiving the funds. He went to live with his wife in 1700, before returning to Rosscastle, where he died in 1701. The final Edgeworth we meet is Richard Edgeworth. Richard was born in 1700, the son of Francis Edgeworth and Mary Bradstone. He was orphaned at the age of 8 and inherited a family estate mired in debt. He was raised at Pakenham Hall near Castlepollard by his half-sister and her husband. Pakenham Hall provided a supportive and cultured environment for the young Richard. Under the guardianship of Mr. Pakenham, he grew up with discipline and values that would later define his approach to life. The warm bond between the Pakenhams and the Edgeworths lasted for generations. When Richard reached adulthood, he returned to Edgeworthstown to confront the daunting challenges of managing the family estate. Decades of mismanagement had left the land mired in debt and the manor house in a state of ruin. Unlike his predecessors, whose gambling and extravagant lifestyles had exacerbated these difficulties, Richard was determined to restore his family fortunes. Richard's legal training equipped him with the tools to tackle the estate's financial and legal entanglements. Slowly and methodically he paid off debts, settled mortgages and rebuilt the estate. His efforts culminated in the construction of a new manor house, which, while modest in design, symbolised stability and progress. In 1731, Richard married Rachel Jane Lovell, the daughter of Sir Salathiel Lovell of Harleston, Northamptonshire. Together they had several children, 4 of which survived to adulthood. The Edgeworths' family life was marked by both joy and hardship. In 1744, Richard Edgeworth and his wife Rachel Jane moved to Bath on medical advice due to the complications she had experienced during childbirth. The birth of a 7th child resulted in Rachel suffering partial paralysis. This child was Richard Lovell Edgeworth. Rachel never fully recovered her health and the family lived in Bath for the remainder of their days, with Richard passing away in 1770. However, he had restored the family estate and his son Richard Lovell took over the running of the estate. So that ends this episode of the podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this look at the history of this amazing family. Please share this podcast with family and friends, and I look forward to future episodes in 2025. If you are interested in learning more about the Society and the history they preserve, please visit www.mariaedgeworthcentre.com. You can sign up to our newsletter, book tours, learn about our annual literary festival and read up on some of the remarkable people who have links to our town.
This has been the Edgeworth Echoes podcast, rediscovering history.